The soft golden light of early morning shimmered across the lake's glassy surface as a crowd of neighbors gathered, murmuring in disbelief. A towering wooden fence, 6 feet high and freshly bolted into the ground, now ran in a perfect line straight through what used to be our community's shared lakefront. It split everything, the lawns, the dock, even the beach chairs, right down the middle. On one side, Margaret stood frozen, mouth agape, her luxury recliners and custom jet ski ramp now boxed in by timber. On the other, I dusted off my hands, tightened the last bolt, and gave a polite wave to the stunned spectators. You're probably wondering how we ended up here. 5 years earlier, I'd bought what I thought was my forever home in Willowbrook Estates, drawn in by the rare privilege of deeded lakefront access. That access wasn't just a perk. It was the crown jewel. A clean beach, a shared dock, and endless summer days spent by the water with my kids. It was a dream realized and worth every dollar I'd paid above market value. That dream began to unravel 6 months ago when Karen Fitzgerald took the helm as president of our HOA. Picture someone with a power complex finally handed a rulebook and a clipboard. Karen turned into exactly that. Suddenly, there were fines for things like grass growing a little too high, bans on garden decorations for being visual clutter, and bizarre rules requiring approval for planting any flowers not on her curated list. It wasn't long before she began handing out favors to her inner circle. Her brother-in-law became our official landscape compliance officer, while her childhood friend conveniently secured the pool service contract. And then came Margaret, Karen's out-of-town cousin. I first noticed something was off one weekday morning. Margaret was sprawled across the shared waterfront like she owned it. Not with a simple chair and a book, but with a full outdoor living setup, chaise lounges, speakers the size of coolers, tiki torches, even workers installing a jet ski ramp. I tried to introduce myself and gently explain that the lakefront was shared, with deeded rights attached to specific homes. She looked me over like I was beneath her and announced, with an air of entitlement, that Karen had given her exclusive use of that half of the lakefront. According to her, I wasn't making enough use of it, and her book club had more vibrant plans for the space. She waved a piece of paper under my nose. An easement reassignment, allegedly approved by the HOA board 3 days earlier. It granted Margaret exclusive use of half the shared lakefront for the duration of her stay. The document claimed unanimous board approval, which I knew was a lie since 2 board members were out of the country when the vote supposedly happened. Something was clearly fishy. I wasted no time. I called the city's planning department and then the county recorder's office. Both confirmed what I already suspected. The lakefront access was tied directly to my property's deed. The HOA didn't have the legal authority to alter that. Any change would require not just HOA consensus, but signed consent from every deed holder, and I certainly hadn't signed a thing. At the next HOA meeting, I brought this up. Karen's face flushed deep red as I calmly explained what I'd found. She clung to her podium and snapped that the HOA had updated its bylaws to include shoreline management, and that any homeowner who challenged a board directive could face $500 per day in fines. She even flashed another dubious-looking document supposedly showing the new bylaw had been approved at a mysterious meeting no one else remembered. Meanwhile, Margaret was treating the shared lakefront like a private resort. Loud music played all day. Her guests parked all over our lawns and left trash behind. The new jet ski ramp was not only illegal, it violated multiple environmental codes. One morning, my young daughter tried to go down for her swim and was physically blocked by Margaret, who told her the beach was now off-limits. That was it for me. I spent the following week buried in documentation. I pulled everything: my purchase agreement, my property's legal survey, the original HOA charter, even dusty minutes from 2 decades of meetings. What I uncovered was exactly what I needed. The deeded access to the lakefront could not be overridden, reassigned, or revoked by the HOA. The charter made it explicitly clear: board members who attempted to interfere with deeded property rights were personally liable for any resulting damages. Armed with this, I sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA and gave them 72 hours to restore access. When they didn't respond, I took matters into my own hands. I had the fence installed right down the property line and through the section of the lakefront tied to my deed. It was legally sound, environmentally permitted, and built to code. Margaret's jet ski ramp now sat useless on her side. The dock split cleanly in two. Karen tried to rally support, but once the neighbors saw the legal proof and heard how blatantly she had overstepped, the tide turned. Several homeowners called for her resignation. As I stood by the fence, watching the stunned crowd process what had happened, I didn't feel smug. I felt vindicated. I hadn't asked for a fight, but I wasn't going to let someone trample over my rights and my family's peace. Not without a response they wouldn't forget. They say peace doesn't last long in a neighborhood run by power-hungry hands. After weeks of growing tension, I finally took decisive action. I issued a formal legal notice addressed to both the HOA and Margaret, giving them 72 hours to remove all personal property from the lakefront and restore public access, or face legal consequences. The notice went out via certified mail and email. Then I waited. By the next morning, the knock came, just as expected. Karen was on my doorstep with Margaret and a man claiming to be a lawyer, though he had the demeanor of someone who'd studied law through courtroom dramas and online forums. They tried persuasion, then intimidation. Karen offered to waive my HOA fees for a year if I would be reasonable. Margaret pitched the idea of sharing access to the lakefront every other Wednesday. The so-called legal expert muttered something absurd about squatters' rights and adverse possession, which nearly made me laugh. I politely declined their attempts, showed them my legal documentation, and watched them storm off in frustration. Karen's parting words promised I'd regret challenging her. The deadline came and went, no changes, no removal of property. In fact, Margaret seemed to double down. More patio furniture appeared, and construction had begun on a permanent structure meant to claim the space as her own. That's when I moved to Phase 2. I hired a licensed surveyor to map the exact property lines of the lakefront. The results were crystal clear. The access rights were split evenly down the middle, with Margaret's sprawling setup extending well into my portion of the shared area. With the survey in hand, I paid a visit to the local building supply store and ordered a large quantity of fencing material. The clerk raised an eyebrow when I explained where it would be going. Small towns love their gossip. By the time I returned home, I had a dozen voicemails from curious neighbors asking if the rumors were true. I confirmed that I was simply securing my property line, legally and peacefully. At dawn the following day, I arrived at the lakefront with a professional crew. Permits in hand, we began installing the wooden fence, straight down the middle. The line was clean and precise, slicing through the beach and even the dock, ending at the water's edge. To anyone who valued fairness and boundaries, it was a thing of beauty. Margaret stepped outside just in time to witness her favorite deck chairs being cut off from reach. Her coffee mug slipped from her hands as she screamed, a high-pitched sound that likely startled wildlife for miles. Minutes later, Karen appeared in bathrobe and curlers, trailed by an impromptu audience of neighbors. What followed was pure theatrical meltdown. Karen accused me of every offense she could name: vandalism, trespassing, emotional distress, even identity theft. She called the police. They reviewed my paperwork and left. She called the city inspector, who confirmed the fence met every legal requirement. Desperate, she reached out to anyone she could, including City Hall and elected officials, but each attempt ended in disappointment. Meanwhile, Margaret realized just how much of her improvements now lay on the wrong side of the fence. Her jet ski ramp was split in two, her speaker system reduced to one woofer per side, and her unfinished shade structure rendered useless, posts now anchored across both properties. Her workers packed up and left without a word. That evening, the HOA called an emergency meeting. Karen had circulated dramatic flyers branding me as a menace to community values. She tried to rally outrage, but as soon as she finished her rant, something unexpected happened. People began to speak up. Tom Harrison, a retired judge, calmly stood and explained how the board's previous actions could result in serious legal consequences. Sarah Chun shared her own experience of losing a garden thanks to Karen's arbitrary landscaping decisions. One by one, neighbors revealed their own grievances. By the time the seventh person spoke, the tide had turned. What started as murmurs for Karen's resignation quickly grew into a unified call for her removal. Then came the final blow. Margaret's husband returned from a work trip, took one look at the fence, the chaos, and his wife's hysteria, and made a swift decision. He ordered their belongings removed and made it clear they were done with the drama. Karen tried one last desperate maneuver. She declared that, as HOA president, she was issuing an executive order to have the fence dismantled. The board's legal advisor, who had remained quiet until then, finally intervened. He informed Karen she had no such authority and that her misuse of HOA funds was already putting the board at risk of litigation. The board voted unanimously to strip Karen of her position effective immediately. But it didn't stop there. A formal investigation revealed that Karen had used HOA funds to draft false easement documents for Margaret, and further auditing showed she'd been funneling money from the landscaping budget to her brother-in-law's company. Charges followed. 3 months later, Karen stood in court facing charges of embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The judge sentenced her to 2 years of probation, 300 hours of community service, and restitution totaling $47,000. As the sentence was read, she broke down in tears, her reign of intimidation and manipulation finally brought to an end.